All right then. So what we have seen so far is we hosted our static website using HTML on S3. And I also mentioned that you could use JavaScript and CSS files also using S3. I was completely serverless. Now remember one thing, if your web page is dynamic, if you plan to host a dynamic website, then you cannot use S3. For that you need some processing power. For that processing power you would need some server running your code. But as long as your web page is static, you can easily host that web page, static web page using S3, because the only thing which you need is a storage. That's it. And AWS S3 will give you that serverless storage. You do not need to create any EC2 instance, attach EBS volumes to that EC2 instance, and then store your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript codes. You can upload that in an S3 bucket, enable static website hosting. That's it. So this portion is done. The logic, the presentation layer is done. Now we'll move forward to the second portion, which is AWS Lambda. Now this is the logic layer. This is where all our logics would be written. Now, and this is where the actual compute will come into picture, because to execute a particular logic, you need some compute power. And now we'll see how that compute power can be made serverless also using AWS Lambda. Now, same is the case with AWS RDS also, the database layer also, which we'll discuss in future. But in this part of the module, I'll talk about AWS Lambda. And we'll use AWS Lambda to host our logic layer and use a Python web application behind that static web page. We'll make some changes as we proceed in this course. So the basic web page which you have seen just now in the previous demo, we'll do some improvisation in that HTML page so that the call is directed to the logic layer in the Python web application. But the crux of the matter is that we'll be hosting the web application in serverless manner using AWS Lambda. So what is AWS Lambda? AWS Lambda is the essence of serverless computing in AWS so far. Now AWS Lambda revolutionized the serverless computing in the cloud computing paradigm. Now it brought in such a huge change that people are actually trying to move as much as they can to serverless hosting or serverless computing, because the cost is less. You don't have to worry about scalability. You don't have to worry about high availability. Everything is maintained and managed by the service provider. You just write your code, upload that to AWS Lambda, and boom, that's all. So your code will be executed. And the most interesting part is that your code will be executed only when it's asked to, or only when there's a trigger. Suppose the same 3-tier application. You could use the same 3-tier application. We'll take example of the same application which we are doing in our case study. You could host the logic tier in AWS EC2 instances behind an auto scaling group, wherein you decide, or you basically provide the scaling policies, and based on that the EC2 instances would scale in or scale out. But it might happen, in fact it would happen, that your web tier or your website will not be accessed all the time. It's not possible that 24/7 your website is being accessed. Now if you use EC2, you should have at least one EC2 instance up and running all the time. I mean, that is a minimum. You cannot have 0 EC2 instances running all the time. And one more thing, even if you had that option, to start an EC2 instance, it takes some time, at least 1 to 2 minutes. And the scaling you have to manage. Now suppose you did some wrong assumption of your application and you need more scaling than what you have provisioned for. That is another problem. That is not that much a problem, but yes, that exists. But if you use serverless computing, all those problems go away, because the scaling is managed by the service provider. The code is executed only when it is needed and as many times as it needed. So scaling is automatic, high availability is automatic. If none of the users are using your website, or let's say your application, you essentially would pay $0, no cost except for the S3 part. That again would be very less. So as I said, AWS Lambda revolutionized the serverless computing paradigm. Let us go ahead and see what this is. So what is Lambda? As I said, it's Lambda is also called a function. So when you write codes using Lambda, you essentially write functions. So those functions are executed based on certain triggers. So what I'll do is we'll go ahead and see what Lambda is, what are the different runtimes are there. Of course, you might have questions saying that what programming languages can be used in Lambda. We'll see that. And also at the end of Lambda's demo, we'll see how to execute Python program using Lambda. And then we'll create our Python program, web application using Python Flask, and we'll deploy that Python program using AWS Lambda.